Is Bob Mould American rock's most underrated songwriter? Yeah, probably. Hello and welcome to 2020 Sound, the channel where we take a look back and take a deep dive and show some love to some albums that have been woefully underappreciated over the years. Now, this is the first episode in a series on Creation Records. Creation Records is quite rightly viewed as one of the greatest record labels of all time, but generally speaking, a lot of the attention that the label gets is focused on certain specific releases and certain specific bands. So it tends to be Oasis, it tends to be the trilogy of classics that they put out in 1991, Bandwagon-esque by Teenage Fanclub, Screamadelica by Primal Scream, and of course, Loveless by My Bloody Valentine. But there is a treasure trove of brilliant albums that label released that just don't get the love that they deserve, and one of those is most definitely the 1992 classic by Sugar, Copper Blue. Bob Mould is, of course, a cult hero, but he should be a much bigger household name than he is, given how many great songs he's written. And Copper Blue presents a 10-song cast iron case for that, taking some of his best work and combining it with the kind of high-impact production that makes those songs shine the best. Bob Mould, of course, made his name in Husker Du with his songwriting partner Grant Hart, and between them, the two of them have written some of the greatest songs I've ever heard, really, in the rock milieu. Milieu, is that how you pronounce it?
Melia.
Melia. But there is one other thing that also unites all those songs, and that is, unfortunately, atrocious production. I remember reading a quote from the producer Chris Goss, who was working with the band Kyuss in the early 90s, and he was saying that the sound that he was going for on their records was a reaction against the sound that the producer Bob Rock was going for on Metallica's Black Album. And he described that sound as sounding like grasshoppers banging on a tin thimble. Well, that to me isn't a description of Metallica's sound. That to me is a description of Grant Hart's snare drum sound. Seriously, Husker Du's sound on record is just awful. I mean, I can appreciate a lo-fi aesthetic, but this isn't lo-fi. This is just terrible. It manages to be too murky, too trebly, too tinny all at the same time. And when you consider like the sound of their label mates, I don't get it. Black Flag didn't sound this bad. The Minutemen sounded great. You know, on SST Records, if you look at what came out in 1984, if you look at the two Totem releases from that year, Double Nickels on the Dime by the Minutemen, Zen Arcade by Husker Du. One of those albums, the Minutemen, still sounds fantastic to this day. It's just a great, great sound. Zen Arcade, don't get me wrong, I'm not slating the songs. The songs are great. It's just the sound. I don't know how they ended up sounding so eviscerated. But when you hear Bob's songs sound as good as the production on Copper Blue makes them sound, you can really hear how Dave Grohl once said that he'd spent his whole life trying to rip off Bob's songs. This is high-fidelity pop rock in excelsis. The soaring melodies, the piston-like precision of David Barb and Malcolm Travis's rhythm section. It's just a glorious sound. Like all the drum fills on this album, it's nearly all snare, and it just gives the songs this incredibly explosive quality. Nirvana had broken through the year before with Nevermind. In fact, Bob had actually toured with them and was, I believe, even in contention to produce that record. As it turns out, he didn't. Of course, Butch Vig ended up producing it, and he created an incredible sound on that album, taking a three-piece band and just making them sound so expansive. And Sugar matched them every step of the way on this record. Bob and Lou Giordano's production has resulted in a really rich, really deep, really varied sound. There's a lot of different textures on this record, different guitar textures, keyboards, interesting like reverse sounds. There's things like the sort of like queasy kind of sound that comes in at the end of Changes. And then there's this unusual sort of like clanking sound, like a roller coaster sort of about to reach its highest point at the start of Slick. And the songs themselves have this depth because they On the surface, they sound so elated, but as you start to scratch beneath the surface, as you start listening to the lyrics, there's such a sadness, such a darkness to some of these tunes. Like one of the standout tracks is Helpless. And when you listen to Helpless, like the riff in that is so triumphant. You know, he could be singing about winning a gold medal at the Olympics for, you know, based off that riff. But when you look at the lyrics, when you hear the chorus, obviously the chorus is, I feel so helpless. Hoover Dam is this grand sounding epic with this bizarre, jaunty little keyboard solo in the middle. And when you hear it, you could easily mistake it for being like a celebration of the construct that is the Hoover Dam. But when you look at the lyrics, covered up with lava and I feel fine, it washes over me, keeps me feeling warm at night. And if you've made a deal with the guy with the horns and the cape, I'll see you later, babe. I'm pretty sure it's about committing suicide and burning in hell. It's stupendously dark. Changes with its chiming guitars and glockenspiel. It sounds like something you could imagine them turning up on Sesame Street and playing this song. A bit like R.E.M. did with Shiny Happy People. But then you look at the lyrics. I remember times you said that you'd be true to me. Look at how the weather's changing. I'm accustomed to your deception. Comes the rule with no exception. And I've been dragged across the river, running far and wide. Come and see how I feel inside. More emo than Elmo. Then, of course, comes the most duplicitous one of all. A good idea. Now, famously, the Pixies once put up an advert for a bass player that was into Peter, Paul and Mary and Husker Du, and they got Kim Deal. And the bass line from A Good Idea is a total tribute to Kim Deal. It's great, but it also leads into a song that I can only describe as the most cheerful song I've ever heard about drowning a woman to death. If you wanted to try and pigeonhole Bob Mould's music, it's not punk really, it's not pop punk, it's not grunge, although it bears the hallmarks of a lot of those genres and subgenres. I think the closest you're going to get to pigeonholing it is calling it fist pumping sadness. It's almost like a trick, like how excited and fun can a song sound while you're actually singing about incredibly miserable dark things. The centerpiece of the album is The Slim, and for once the music and the lyrics are actually kind of singing from the same hymn sheet. They create this really foreboding sense. The music is just full of these sort of descending swoops and these unnerving little guitar solos, and the song itself, the lyric, is written from the perspective of a man watching his lover die from AIDS. The lyrics are just harrowing. When you left with your death, I felt empty when I looked back. On my pillow, what you used to say, I'm left behind. I think anyone who's ever experienced a bereavement of that scale can just find something incredibly resonant about the lyrics to this song. Things get at least a little bit happier in the latter half of the album. At least there's less death. The perfect example of that is If I Can't Change Your Mind, which has this great Birds-like sort of alt-rock sound that was just really, really popular in the early 90s. You know, it's very Lemonheads, very Gigolo Ants. You can imagine this song soundtracking a sitcom if its lyrics were about a successful relationship rather than a relationship in decline. It's very catchy, as is Fortune Teller, as is Man on the Moon. Copper Blue is just full of massive hooks. It's a very punchy 10 songs, which is kind of interesting because apparently the session started with 30 songs, some of which ended up on Copper Blue's companion mini-album, Beaster. Released the following year in 1993 and with a loose sort of religious theme, it's a much darker album than Copper Blue. But somehow it's also much less consistent, even though it's only 6 songs long. Having said that, it does have probably my two favourite Sugar songs on it. The first being Tilted, which is breathtaking in its ferocity. If the sound at the beginning of Slick was a roller coaster climbing to the top, then Tilted is the sound of that roller coaster crashing down to earth, derailing, smashing through the pavement, landing in hell and hitting the ground with such force that it just explodes all of Satan's lair. Or, you know, something like that. And the other is JC Auto, which sounds like something off Queens of the Stone Age's first album. You know, it's got this really sleazy riff, really like pounding drums. It just sounds like a sexy T-Rex with a messiah complex. If the next Jurassic World has that as its plot, I'm going to be so pissed off. Both Copper Blue and Beaster were far from underrated at the time. Copper Blue was voted the best album of 1992 by the NME, while Beaster went as high as number 3 in the UK album charts. But the band fell out of the conversation, I think partly because they didn't really belong to any scene. By the end of the 90s, the Pixies, Pearl Jam, and especially Nirvana was still very much being talked about by my friends and by music critics. But no one ever mentioned Sugar. The first I ever heard of Bob Mould and Sugar and Husker Du was in a interview in Metal Hammer, I think, where Andy Cairns, is that how you pronounce his name? The singer from Therapy was interviewing Bob. No one my age knew who they were. People still don't really talk about them that often, so they're still very much in the underrated column for me. Husker Du are understandably the more exalted of the two groups, which makes sense given the size of their back catalogue and given the influence that they had and the influence of the bands that they influenced. But I don't think Husker Du ever produced an album as good, as consistently good as Copper Blue. For me, it's an incredibly consistent slab of nigh-on perfect alternative rock. Bob's still making wonderful music. Check out American Crisis. It's him at his raging, catchy, ferocious pop punk rock best. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about Copper Blue, Sugar, Bob Mould and Husker Du in the comments. Give us a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe below for more music reviews and commentary on underrated classics from indie and alternative rock history.